Dan Smith is an award-winning author writing for both children and adults, and his thrilling adventure stories are often inspired by his time living around the world, including in Sierra Leone, Brazil and Russia. His debut novel for younger readers, My Friend the Enemy, was longlisted for the Branford Boase Award in 2014 and shortlisted for the Historical Association Young Quills. In 2017, his novel Boy X won the Essex Book Award, the Phoenix Book Award and the Coventry Inspiration Book Award. Dan met with Nikki Gamble to talk about his latest novel, She-Wolf, a book about Vikings, vengeance and wolves.
As always, I like to ask writers at the start of our interviews just to set up the book so that readers know a little bit about it.
Right, so She-Wolf is set in the year 866 in the Kingdom of Northumbria, and it's about a young Danish girl called Ylva who comes across to England and very quickly finds herself alone and orphaned when her mother is apparently murdered by a three-fingered man, a Viking. And Ylva is also a Viking, and Vikings, revenge was a very important part of Viking culture. They believed that if somebody wronged them, then it was their duty to get their own back, to get revenge. So Ylva swears to the gods that she will get revenge. And she sets out across the snowy forests of the Kingdom of Northumbria to hunt down the three-fingered man and kill him, which turns out to be a lot more difficult than she thought it was going to be. She has her faithful dog Gary, who she loves more than anything in the world, and she reluctantly accepts help from a Saxon warrior called Catherine and her sidekick, I guess you'd call him, called Bronn. But very quickly the tables are turned and they find that they are the ones who are being hunted by the three-fingered man. And not just by the three-fingered man, but also by a pack of very hungry wolves that lives in the forest.
And what's the name that you give to that tribe that the three-fingered man belongs to?
The Ulfhedna. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
The half-skulls.
The half-skulls, yeah. Well, she calls them the half-skulls because they wear scarves around the lower part of their faces, which are painted with the design of half a wolf's skull. Yes. Wow. And she comes to believe that they are Ulfhedna, which was a kind of Viking warrior. And Vikings believed that these warriors were inhabited by the spirits of wolves.
Right, okay. So I think you're going to read a little bit just to give us a flavour of the story. Yeah,
so this is from the very beginning of the book, or is the best place to read from, I think, chapter 1, which is called The Three-Fingered Man. Ylva flinched when she heard Mother shout. It was unexpected, and the sound was so full of fear and pain it took her a moment to realise what it was. A second shout told her she hadn't imagined the first, and when it cut short there was only silence from the hut. Crouching in the snow-covered bracken at the edge of the forest, Ylva kept her arm around her dog Gary and stared across the track at the lopsided door of the trader's hut. Her fingers tightened around the leather-bound handle of her axe, hard enough to make her knuckles pop. Trees creaked and cried in the wind that flooded the mountainside. When the door opened, a bald and bearded giant of a man emerged and stepped down into the deep snow that lay on the track. As tall and wide as two ordinary men, he had blue tattooed runes arched over each ear, and a history of past battles etched in scars on his face. Rings of black coal were painted around the palest blue eyes, making them fade into his skull like the eyes of the dead. A Viking raider, Ylva thought, probably from the same shores she had sailed from. Dressed in grey wolf furs, he moved slowly like a beast, walking with his head down, a sword hanging loose in his left hand. The blade was wet with blood.
And it is a thrilling story.
Oh, well, I hope so.
There's a lot that I want to explore, but listening to you read that, one of the things that really strikes you is the kind of physical appearance of these people. And one of them later on actually has his teeth filed into points. Is there evidence that they did that?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, they did all kinds. And actually not just Vikings, because I'm researching for a story about another ancient culture now, and it was quite common in that culture too. So some of them filed their teeth to points, and others filed grooves, which I think some of them do in the book. They
You
filed
said
grooves
and they filled it with red.
and filled it with dye. Yeah,
Gosh.
yeah, to give themselves a frightening appearance, I suppose.
Wow. So they were the precursors of the punk era.
Maybe they were,
trying
yeah,
to really
maybe they were.
terrify their
Maybe. And I imagine it would have been absolutely terrifying to be faced with a horde of Vikings.
Yes. Now, it's the first time that you've written about the Viking era. So I did wonder whether you had to do much research of this period, and if you did, what that method of research was.
Oh, I did do a lot of research, yeah. I knew very little about Vikings. My extent of Viking knowledge was perhaps that I knew they didn't wear horned helmets, which I think every kid at school knows. So I didn't write it as a Viking story to begin with. I wrote it as a Western. So I wrote a Western and sent it to my publisher, who loved it, and they really liked the character and they really liked the story, but they felt that it would be too difficult to sell a Western because Westerns not very popular. People don't buy Westerns. They'd had experience of trying to sell Westerns before that hadn't done well. So, but they wanted to keep the characters and they wanted to keep the story. So it was about trying to find a similar kind of setting. So I know Vikings and Westerns are very different, but there's a similarity in the sense of the kind of lawlessness and that sort of frontier discovery. So I went away and did lots of research about Vikings. In fact, my publisher sent me a box set of the TV show Vikings. So that was what I first did, was watch that. And after watching that, I thought, oh, of course, Vikings. Why didn't I think of Vikings before? Because there's so much to write about Vikings. And then I did, looking into the history, reading lots of books, visiting museums, lots of research online. I read all the Norse mythology, of course, which is amazing, and looked into all the sagas of the great Viking heroes.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating to hear you say that, because I'd rather assumed, obviously incorrectly, that because you're from the northeast, that you were so steeped in Viking culture.
I'm a Viking, yeah.
That's what had been the starting point for the story. And yet when I was reading it, I did get that sense of the Western, the Revenant, Leonardo DiCaprio struggling against the environment.
Yes, I watched that as part of my research, to get that kind of snowy, icy, and also the survival, because a lot of the story is about survival. For much of the story, Ylva's alone, just with her dog in the wilderness, and she has to survive. But I think probably in those days people would have been more equipped to survive than we are now, because it was their way of life.
Battling against the cold.
Yeah,
I could really feel that in my bones as I was.
Yeah, well, that's interesting though, because of course everything involved research. So when Ylva stops in the forest and she needs a fire, my first thought was, how did they make fire? 1,000 years ago, how did Vikings make fire?
Yeah.
And I found that they had all kinds of interesting ways of doing that.
Yeah. Let's just take that word Viking for a moment. I've read in your afterword that actually that word didn't really exist, did it, at this period in time?
No, I think there's a lot of debate about that. And that it was, people think that it was a word that arose much, much later, well after the Viking Age. And I think it has a connotation more of being like a pirate, I think. So not all Norse people were Vikings. It would have only been those people who got on a boat and sailed across to another land to raid. They would have been Vikings. But at the time, they wouldn't have called them Vikings.
Yeah. Ylva at one point says that her father was a berserker.
Yeah.
So these are the real...
Yeah, well, that's interesting as well.
Vikings,
I had to do quite a lot of research into that. So there's the Ulfednar and the Berserkers. So the Ulfednar was supposedly inhabited by the spirits of wolves, and the Berserkers were supposedly inhabited by the spirits of bears. And there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not they actually existed, or if they did, what they were. I think for a long time people thought that they were these sort of crazy guys who went in first into battle. But now I think the thinking's coming round more to believing that they were elite soldiers, and that they would have been perhaps the people who were guarding kings or important people.
Interesting. And of course, it is where we get the word berserk and to
Yeah,
go
of course,
berserk
yeah.
from. And language is an interesting thing in this book because here we have Danes, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and yet they seem to be able to understand each other.
Yeah, which is quite lucky for me. Because when I first started it, I was thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to make sure that Ylva can understand what Catherine's saying? Because Ylva's a Dane and Catherine is an Anglo-Saxon. And in my initial version of it, I did have an explanation as to why they could speak to each other. But I then found out in my research that, in fact, Norse and Anglo-Saxon were very similar anyway, and it would have been more like dialect, so the equivalent, I guess, of maybe somebody from Liverpool going to Newcastle. They would have spoken the words in a slightly different way, but they would have understood each other, because Vikings and Anglo-Saxons all were descended, as I understand it, from the same Germanic tribes. So some of those tribes had gone to Scandinavia and raided and settled, and some had come to Britain and settled there.
Do the Vikings get a bad press?
It's an interesting question, because I think there was a period several years ago where people thought maybe they did get a bad press, and that actually they were quite peaceful and they were farmers. And but now we're coming back around to the thinking that actually they were pretty vicious, violent raiders. They were farmers as well. They were adventurers. They were traders. They were travellers. They were amazing shipbuilders. They were, in lots of ways, very forward-thinking as well. I think for instance, women had rights that Christian women over in Britain didn't have. So women had the right to divorce. They had the right to own land. They could be warriors. They could be leaders. And interestingly, when the Vikings converted to Christianity, those women lost those rights.
Right. It has to be said that your novel has strong women.
Yeah.
You've obviously Catherine Ylva herself.
Yeah.
And her mother, the presence of her mother, even though her mother obviously, as we've heard, departs quite quickly, but it is about strong women, really.
It is, yeah. And I think one of the things that Ylva talks about is that she wants to be a shield maiden. She talks about being a shield maiden. And I did a bit of research into shield maidens as well, because they are mentioned in quite a few Norse sagas. And I think for a long time the thinking was that they were a bit of a myth, and that they didn't actually exist, and that women didn't get on long ships and go away to raid. But interestingly, there was a Viking burial site was found on an island called Birka, I think that's the correct spelling, off the coast of Sweden back in the 1800s. And in the grave there's a skeleton and skeletons of horses. There's also a sword, and Vikings didn't really own swords unless they were very wealthy. And there are arrowheads and various other things, so it was always assumed that this was a great king. And it's only recently, within the past 5 years, that a bioarchaeologist was visiting the museum where this is displayed, and she noticed the skeleton, some things about the skeleton that she was interested in. I think it was particularly the pelvis. She thought looked like it belonged to a woman. And of course everybody dismissed this as absolute rubbish, and to prove her wrong they took DNA from the bones and tested them, and it was a woman. So the Birka warrior, who was thought to be this great king, was a woman. So there was the evidence that there were female Viking warriors.
It is fascinating because you come to accept certain interpretations of history as fact, and you only have to go back, I think, to the 1960s and 50s to realise that the way in which history is written then is quite clearly subjective. So at the time that I was studying history in primary school, R.J. Unstead was the key historical text, and it talks about cave men, and it talks about the women, his wife. Did cavemen have wives?
Yeah,
but anyway, his wife,
yeah.
his wife who scraped the skin to make the clothes, apparently. But there's no real evidence for that. That is somebody putting their own values of the period in which they're writing onto history, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the things I discovered was that there's lots of things we don't know about the Norse people, or lots of things that we've assumed or guessed. They didn't have any written language, apart from, at school kids always learn about the runes, but I think runes were only used for very minimal sort of messaging, or for marking on maybe tombs and that kind of thing.
So the fact that they were carved would have taken a long time. So you're not writing.
No, they didn't.
You're not
they didn't write any texts. No, so all their sagas were passed down by mouth. And it was only much later that they were written down, and they're known as the Icelandic sagas because it was once they'd settled in Iceland that eventually they were written down. So they didn't keep any of their own history in terms of writing it down, so we haven't got that to refer to. The only written history we have of them is in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was written by Anglo-Saxons, of course, who defeated the Vikings, of course. So we can't really rely on what they tell us, really, because they were the victors, and we know that victors tend to write the history the way they want it written. So there's loads we don't know about them.
I was fascinated by your character Bronn, who appears, you describe him as being very dark skinned. Yeah. So where does he come from, and how does he fit into the story?
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because in my original version of the story, when it was a Western, he was a Native American. And I gave myself the very difficult task of having a character who doesn't speak. And I discovered that Native Americans had this universal sign language that the tribes all used to use to communicate when they came together, because they all spoke different languages. But then when I converted it to a Viking story, I still wanted Bronn to be different, because I wanted Ylva to be particularly suspicious and wary of him. And I decided I wanted to keep him as a person of colour. So I did a lot of research to find out if that was feasible, and if there would have been dark-skinned people in Britain at the time. And it was, I think, my Roman history is a little bit sketchy, but I think it was probably about 300 or 400 years. The book's set 300 or 400 years after the Romans had left Britain, and I found a lot of evidence. I didn't discover the evidence myself, but people had discovered evidence that along Hadrian's Wall, a lot of the soldiers, the Roman soldiers who were posted there, had come from North Africa. And so there would have been people with dark skin there, and a lot of them stayed behind, and they would have intermarried with the people who were, I was going to say indigenous, but I don't even know if the people were indigenous then, because everybody invaded Britain.
Yes, yeah. One of the other things that really struck me in the book was the landscape as adversary for the character here. Tell us a little bit about, because it's just beautifully realised, your landscape.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I like to write about the landscape, I think, and it's often an adversary in my books. I would say probably most of my stories have difficult landscape, and I did take a few liberties with the landscape. So there aren't any mountains in that area, but I put some in anyway. I wanted there to be a difference in the landscape. I think when you're looking at a story like that, where the journey and the travelling is very significant, and the landscape and the terrain is very significant, I think it needs to be varied. So I put mountains in, and I put it close to the sea as well. Anybody from the northeast has, I think knows that the sea is important to us, whether you like being on it or just looking at it. It's always there. So I like stories where people are faced with the elements and they have to survive.
It's very snowy.
It's very snowy, yeah. Yeah, I wrote another book. One of my adult thrillers is very, very snowy. Well, two of them actually are very snowy. They're set in Eastern Europe. And I was writing one of them when it snowed very heavily in the northeast, and I one of the characters in my book is forced to walk barefoot in the snow, which was something that the Soviets used to do to people as a punishment. So I went out in the garden in my bare feet.
How long did you
I think I
last?
lasted about 30 seconds or something before I had to go in. Oh, it was painful, very painful, yeah.
I suppose once you get through the pain, maybe you can't feel
Maybe.
anything anymore. I don't know. It sounds
it was
absolutely horrific.
It was.
It's a journey. It's also a mystery. And I don't want you to give too much away, because the whole purpose of mystery is that you don't give too much away. But I wondered, in terms of planning that, whether you had to think about what you would reveal and when you would reveal it.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's a mystery, because I think I made life difficult for myself, because nothing is quite what it seems and nobody is quite who they seem to be. And no, I didn't plan it. So every time I thought, oh, wouldn't it be good if, I would have to stop, go back to the beginning and try and find all the instances where I could maybe drop in some clues or take out anything that was too obvious. But I do tend to write a bit like that anyway. I often write without a plan, and then I go back to the beginning and I have to change my characters. So Ylva was very different, I think, when I first wrote it. And as I continued, I realised that I wanted her to be a very particular kind of character. She's very difficult, very awkward, maybe not immediately likeable, very single-minded, very fierce.
Which goes beyond the circumstance of her mother's demise, doesn't it?
Yeah, she's. I think if she were alive today, she'd be diagnosed on the spectrum. But of course, 1,000 years ago, they didn't know what that was. So people just treat her as if she's a bit odd or a bit different. But Catherine seems to kind of understand her, or at least accommodate for her and allow for the fact that she behaves in an unusual way. She doesn't like being touched. She has these kind of tics that help her overcome difficult situations that she finds herself in.
Animals are very important to her.
They are, yeah. Well, actually, when I first sent it to my publisher, she didn't have the dog. She had a brother. So it was about her protecting her brother. But I had a phone call. My publisher said, now, don't say no before I've finished, but how would you feel if her brother was a dog? And at first I thought, that's what? Really? But actually it made a lot of sense, because being nice to animals or having a connection with animals is kind of like shorthand for showing that somebody has a good side to them. And I think it helped soften Ylva's character, because I have seen one or two people review it and say, oh, I didn't like her, because she isn't likeable immediately, but there's a lot about her that is likeable. I think she's she's very loyal. She's has this great sense of duty and honour, and she's very, very brave. She's only 13, and yet she goes on this amazing quest. But then, of course, I suppose a 13-year-old in those days wouldn't have been like a 13-year-old now, because at 13 a girl would have got married and would have been considered to be an adult.
It's interesting, because now I couldn't imagine her having a brother. The dog feels so right. It
does, yeah. Well, same for me, yeah. But I do still have that version of her with a brother. Yeah. But the dog is absolutely right. But also, it's significant with other things that happen later in the story. It kind of tied in really nicely with some of the things that happened with the wolves. It just kind of fit, and it was right. So editors are good. Editors kind of see things in stories that authors often don't see, because you get too close to it, and you need somebody who can sort of step back and look at it in a different way.
So the story is propelled partly through this notion of journey, but the driving motivation for this is revenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's very much part of the culture of where she comes from.
Yeah, but it's a great motive, isn't it? I mean, there must be so many stories where revenge is the motivation, isn't it? And also, it was very important to Vikings. Very important to Vikings. And so I use a lot of little stories. I've made up some stories, and I've also used some other, what we think might be true stories about revenge that are the things that play on her mind and that drive her. So this happens at the time of the invasion of the Great Heathen Army, when all the Viking kind of villages and gangs and clubs and whatever you would call them all got together and came over to England to invade. And although no one's entirely sure why they did it, because previously they'd always raided in small groups, but according to the sagas, it was revenge. That's why they came, because King Aelle of Northumbria had executed Ragnar Lothbrok, who was this great Viking hero who was supposedly one of the first raiders over here. So when he was executed, his sons came to take revenge, and they brought with them all of the other armies that they could gather.
Once you go down that route, it's never ending. It's like all your Greek tragedies. There's no end to it.
Well, that's right, and that's what Ylva learns, of course, is that revenge is not, it's not a simple thing.
Yeah. So having delved back into this period of history is much further back than any of your other writing. I know you've written about the war period.
Yes, I have.
But you've not gone back to 1,000 years
plus.
No. So
and it's
can you
difficult to
imagine
research.
yourself doing that again?
Historical
writing.
Yeah, well, I kind of am. So not quite as far. So I'm writing and researching at the same time something which is set in the 16th century, sort of beginning of, in Mesoamerica, so Central America, which is also proven to be difficult as well, because again, it's one of those cultures
16th
where...
16th century, is that Columbian?
So it's pre-Columbian.
Pre-Columbian.
Yeah, just pre-Columbian. It's the sort of post-classic Mayan period. So not the... when we think of Mayans, we often think of the classic period, but this is just after that. Yeah, but again, really hard to research, because although they did have writing, their writing until very recently has been misunderstood and misinterpreted, and the Spanish destroyed a lot of their writing. So anything that was written on paper, I think there's only 3 books or codices, as they're called, that still exist. Other than that, they destroyed everything.
So you said earlier when we were talking that you lived for a time in Brazil.
I did.
Is that right? So is that where this interest came from?
I don't know. Maybe. Yeah. Definitely the adventure. Definitely spent a lot of time in the jungle and on rivers out in the middle of nowhere fishing, and enjoying all the kind of weird and wonderful folk stories that people used to tell. Met some very interesting characters, murderers and all kinds of all kinds of people, hitmen, and so that's all definitely tapped into my love of writing those kind of stories, I suppose. Yeah.
So just before we leave She-Wolf completely, what was the best bit for you about writing this story? What did you most enjoy?
Oh, what did I most enjoy? If you'd asked me at the time, I'd have said I didn't enjoy any of it. Because what's the famous quote is, I like having written. Because writing's hard work. It's much harder than people maybe imagine. So what was the best bit? Well, I loved doing the research, actually. I enjoyed that a lot. Because there's so much good stuff, I think, about Vikings to read. But also Ylva. I love Ylva. I think she's a great character. And I would like to maybe write about her again one day. Would be fun, because I know what happens to her, so I know what she does next.
I think we need that story.
Vikings would be great. I love Vikings.
Can I just thank you so much for talking to us today, Dan? It's been an amazing journey back into the past. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues. Just Imagine also has a free fortnightly newsletter packed full of the latest news, CPD training, reviews and giveaways. To sign up, visit justimagine.co.uk /newsletter.